You go by many titles: Dad,
It's time to get out.
No.
Night Manager, and Carpool Captain.
Hey guys, let's go, come on. Everybody in.
So adding a student title might feel daunting. But what if a school could be there for all of you? Career, family, finances, and mental health. National University believes supporting all your titles can lead to another one. Successful graduate. National University, supporting the whole you. Learn more at nu.edu.
Hello, everyone. This is Ray, and I'm here with Chris, and we're here to talk about the start of Season 2 of our podcast, History You Didn't Know But Should. You know, Chris, I think we had 30 episodes in Season 1, and what a season it was. We covered everything from presidents to small town figures who, probably 99% of people never heard of, to events that changed the course of history. I mean, we've covered the map in Season 1, and we plan to do the same thing in Season 2.
It's been a great Season 1. I remember this started out just having conversations about various things, and then we decided to take our conversations in the office to viewers all across the world. And I don't know about you, but I've been blessed by the followers that we've gained, by the comments that we've received, and they want us back for a second season.
Yeah.
I can't believe it. And I am super excited about this because, Ray, as we start Season 2, we're planning on bigger and better things. We've got some great topics that are lined up, and the new topic starts right here, right now, doesn't it?
That's right. We start the second season with the Scopes monkey trial. Evolution versus creation. You can't get any more hot topic than that. And we're going to be looking at the 4th of July. We're going to be looking at all sorts of things you didn't know, some things we didn't know until we started researching it.
Yeah, and we're really excited because it's going to take us once again into the aspects of southeastern North Carolina, but we're also going to branch out.
Yep.
We're hoping to do some world history topics, along with some more interesting looks at individual lives and how they have impacted us even today. So we strongly encourage our listeners, if there's something you're curious about, if there's a topic that maybe you heard a little bit about, but there's more that you'd like to know, send us an email, comment on Facebook and all of the other platforms that we have, and we would love to be able to discuss those topics.
Yeah, we really would. We would really love to hear more input. We, like Chris said, we have received it, and we're grateful for those of you who have taken time to provide us with some input, mostly comments about what you like, what you don't like, any suggestions you have. Our email address, we always give it at the end of the show, but it is historyyousshouldknow@gmail.com. That's history, the letter you should know, at gmail.com. And Chris, I think one thing we've been thinking about is maybe doing some videos to add to our podcast, and we'll be looking more into that this season if it comes about.
Yeah, we're actually planning on going on location in a couple of weeks. We're going to be heading down to a few spots where we have some interesting stories that we're going to tell, and we're going to have some video/audio. We're thinking about bringing some more guests on who can add some context to some of the topics that we've been discussing, and I'm just really excited about this podcast, and we could not do this if it wasn't for our listeners. So I know on behalf of Ray and myself, thank you so much for taking a few minutes out of your day to tune in to us and to engage with us as together we're learning. We are grateful for your support and invite you to send out this information to others that may not have heard about our podcast, so they can become part of our community of learners.
Yep. And now, without further ado, let's start episode 1 of season 2, the Scopes monkey trial. Hi, and welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And today we're going to be going back and we're going to be looking at the Scopes monkey trial in 1925. And I think, Chris, this is one of those issues people maybe heard of, maybe they even know something about the issues related to the trial because they're issues that are still in contention today. But I think a lot of people don't know anything about the trial itself or some of the characters involved in the trial.
Yeah, Ray, I think that this is an important podcast for us to talk about today, because if you look at what's going on in our society today, it's really very similar to what was going on here in the 1920s. There's a big discussion about the economy, about academic freedom, about intellectual movement and what can be taught in the schools and what people can say. And there is just this religion is also a huge play. So I think that our listeners will kind of be able to see how things are today because of this one event that took place and the implications that came from it. And so I look forward to discussing it, the trial of the century before there was an OJ.
Yes, absolutely. And it really comes back to, you mentioned what's going on in our day to day. You have this idea in the 1920s and today to some degree of modernity, modern technology, modern academic views, modern science versus traditionalism. Sort of the way things have been, we don't really want to change much from the way things have been. And that's really at the heart of the Scopes monkey trial. Modernity with evolution, the teaching of evolution, and then the traditional side with the teaching of creationism in different forms. As we're going to see, there were different forms of creationism that even came out in the Scopes monkey trial itself. So, of course, if we're going to be talking about evolution and creationism, we really need to go back into the 19th century in 1859, when Charles Darwin published his book, The Origin of Species, which, of course, was the sort of his opening salvo, so to speak, on the issue of natural, I don't want to say atheistic, but the idea of natural evolution type of thing. And he followed that in 1871 with The Descent of Man, in that he said that man is descended from a hairy, this sort of hairy creature that, I guess like a monkey, that evolved into humans. And then in 1914, George William Hunter's book, A Civic Biology, was published. And that book is going to play a big role in the Scopes monkey trial. So when we come to the Scopes monkey trial, we go to Dayton, Tennessee in the 1920s, specifically in 1925, Chris. There was a law passed in the Tennessee legislature called the Butler Law, and it forbade the teaching of Darwin's theory of evolution in any public school or university. And I want to, if you'll give me just a second, Chris, I want to take a moment to read a little bit from this law. It has 3 sections, but it says in part, be it enacted by the General Assembly of the state of Tennessee, that it shall be unlawful for any teacher of the universities, normals, and all other public schools of the state, which are supported in whole or in part by the public school funds of the state, to teach any theory that denies the story of divine creation of man as taught in the Bible, and to teach instead that man has descended from a lower order of animals. And Chris, it made teaching evolution in a university, a normal school, or a public school a misdemeanor, where a person could be fined $100, but not more than $500 for each offense of teaching the theory of evolution. So that, of course, Chris, gets to this idea of academic freedom. What are teachers at universities, at high schools, what are they allowed to teach and what are they not allowed to teach?
Yeah, and I think there's several things to look at when you're talking about the Butler Act and just the location. We have to remind ourselves this is taking place in Dayton, Tennessee. There is a huge discrepancy between urban and rural. And Governor Pete of Tennessee basically said, listen, the people have the right, and they must have the right to regulate what is taught in the schools. And if you think about 1925, there's a lot happening. Number one, F. Scott Fitzgerald has written the book, The Great Gatsby. People are reading that. They're thinking, oh my gosh, we can dance to the Charleston. We've got Duke Ellington. We're making money. I mean, life is really, really, really good. I mean, this is the roaring 20s. There is economic boom, just not everywhere. And one of the places where the economic boom is in Dayton, Tennessee. they're at this point going through some of the worst economic downturn, if you will. They are being sustained by the coal industry. And what happens is coal is starting to decline, and the stores are closing down, and these factories are closing down. And so you have a dwindling of the population in Dayton. And this is where it gets interesting, right? So you have the Butler Act, which is saying, hey, we want to regulate what's right, what can be said, and all of that. You've got a rural group of people who are saying, we don't want an urban group of people telling us what we can do and what we can't do. But there's also another thing. People are looking for notoriety. People are looking to bring money into their particular area. They're looking for a way in which we can maybe reverse economic decline. And what better way is there than to start this massive debate? And if you want to start a massive debate, the one topic that will get people fighting is religion. And so when this moment comes about, the Dayton, Tennessee, right? It's urban and rural divide. You've got economic downturn. And so they use religion about what should be taught in schools, what shouldn't be taught in schools. And Ray, that leads us to this whole idea of progressivism that's going on in our nation's history at this time. And so you're trying to balance progressives and conservative Christians who want to return to the fundamental religious principles of life as it was in rural America. So that introduces us to this group that's known as the fundamentalist.
Yeah, and it sounds so familiar when you're talking there about the 1920s and what's going on here in Tennessee. It sounds like you're talking about 2021, Chris. There's so many similarities between what was going on here in the early 1920s and what's going on today in the early 2020s. Now, all of this is really going to get started, the trial itself, at a little drugstore there in Dayton, Tennessee, called Fred Robinson's Drugstore. And I did some research, and I don't know if the structure is still there or not, but there was this little drugstore, and a group of men, including a 31-year-old New Yorker who had moved into the area as a coal miner, a coal company manager, comes into this drugstore, and he meets with some people in there, and he's got a newspaper announcement in which the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, has basically put up an offer to challenge this new Butler Act there in Tennessee, or what they called this anti-evolution statute. And they thought this was a wonderful opportunity, like you said, Chris, to put Dayton, Tennessee on the map. I mean, you mentioned the loss of population. Just think about this. In 35 years, in 1890s, the population of this small town was around 3,000. In 1925, it was around 1,800. So they were looking for an opportunity to bring some attention to this town, but also, I think, like you said, to sort of show the division between modernity, progressivism versus the traditionalists.
Yeah, and I think it might be wise for us to do a little more introduction to the ACLU, because the ACLU, known as the American Civil Liberties Union, very well known in today's society. They are very engaged in a lot of the social issues that's going on in our present time. But in the 1920s, they were relatively new, but they were dedicated to defending and preserving individual rights as specified within the Constitution. That was their idea, is that they wanted individuals to be able to have the right to say what they wanted to say, to teach what they wanted to teach, to believe what they wanted to believe. And so they are looking for somebody who will challenge this Butler Act, because they want to try to resolve this dispute between the fundamentalists, who believe that the Bible is infallible, that it's a literal interpretation of the Bible, versus the modernists, as you have mentioned, who, basically were in agreement with science. And there's an issue between faith and science in the 1920s. There's an issue in faith and science here in 2021. And so the ACLU I mean, they put out an ad in a paper looking for someone who they're saying like, hey, we want a Tennessee teacher who's willing to accept our services. And we just want you to test the constitutionality of the law. And they actually said, hey, look, if you agree to this, you're not going to get put in jail. Nothing's going to happen to you. You'll be cool. And Ray, they actually wanted a guy by the name of Mr. W.F. Ferguson to be the guy who actually he did it. He was a biology teacher at the time, but he was also principal. And the problem is he had a family. He was very well known in the community. He was a principal. And they're like, oh my gosh, if you are the one, this might not work out very well. So that's how we get introduced to Mr. Scopes. And Ray, I know you know a few things about Mr. Scopes, but man, a first-year teacher, single, 25 years old, and basically they say, hey, you, stand up to the government.
He wasn't really a teacher. He was a part-time football coach and basically a substitute teacher who had been brought in to substitute in a science class. And when he's brought in by this group of men who had been meeting in Fred Robinson's drugstore, they basically say, you can't teach biology without teaching evolution, can you? And he basically says, no, you can't. And he pulls out a copy I mentioned a few minutes ago from 1914, George William Hunter's A Civic Biology. And it, of course, teached the idea or the theory of evolution. And he tells them, look, this is the state-approved textbook. And I assigned readings in this textbook that did cover the issue of evolution. And the guys in the drugstore said, then you've been breaking the law. And they say, basically, are you willing to be a defendant in this test case on evolution? And he agreed.
Yeah, and isn't it interesting? They're making this big deal about Hunter's civic biology textbook, and yet the very place they're meeting in the Robinson's drugstore, that textbook was sold in that store. Yes. And so they're making a big deal about a textbook, but the guy's not upset about making money if he sells it.
Yeah, I mean, it is. They did sell textbooks there in the store. I mean, I bet college students and stuff today wish they could go to the local drugstore and buy a copy of their textbook. Be a little cheaper than maybe some other options that students have. So anyway, they have to put together a defense team for Mr. John Scopes, and they also, of course, have to put together a prosecution. And for the prosecution, they get a guy called William Jennings Bryan, who's going to sort of prosecute the case against Mr. John Scopes. Now, William Jennings Bryan is one of my favorite characters, historical characters from this time in history, because I think about someone who you sometimes hear about this person's run for president time and time again. And that's who William Jennings Bryan was. He had ran for president on the Democrat ticket 3 different times. Of course, he claimed to be a Christian. He had gone around just a few years prior to this, preaching sermons in 1921 called The Menace of Darwinism, and another one called The Bible and Its Enemies. In 1924, he delivers a lecture in Nashville called Is the Bible True? So he's representing the traditional side. He is the prosecution. He's going to be the one responsible for prosecuting, bringing the case against John Scopes. Now, of course, there are other people on the prosecution side. I don't want to make it sound like William Jennings Bryan was the only one, but he was sort of the one that I think is the most popular and maybe from our perspective, maybe the most important. And then, of course, Chris, you want to talk a little bit about Clarence Darrow, who was the defense attorney.
Yeah, so, you have Bryan, who's this staunch fundamentalist. He's a defender of the Bible, very well known, as you mentioned. But then you have Clarence Darrow, who is probably at this time the most recognized attorney in the country. And he, along the same lines as William Jennings Bryan, says, you know what? I'll take the case, and you don't have to pay me a dime. I am more than happy to take this case on for free. And this Clarence Darrow is this really good criminal defense attorney. He would, I mean, whenever there was something really bad going on, this is the guy OJ would have wanted, right? I mean, I keep going back to OJ, but this is the guy that he would have wanted because he could get anybody off no matter what. However, Darrow was also an avowed agnostic. And it is setting up to be the trial of the century. And I think off the air, you were talking a little bit about the state, this being staged. Right. And, you know, here you have this staunch fundamentalist believes that the Bible is infallible, it is literal. And then you get Darrow, who is like, hold on, wait a second. I am completely against what that you're saying. And so they're two heavyweights meeting in Dayton, Tennessee to talk about the Butler Act. And on trial is this first year single 25-year-old teacher. You wouldn't expect these two guys to show up in Dayton, Tennessee for a trial like this, unless there was something bigger online.
Yeah, much bigger. And you know what, Chris? It's going to get big fast because newspapers around the nation are going to talk about this, and they are expecting a lot of people. And in May through June of 1925, the city of Dayton has to prepare for nearly 1,000 people. And hundreds of these people, of course, would be reporters from all over the nation who are just going to descend upon the courthouse there. And it's going to almost have a carnival atmosphere. You're going to have people with banners and lemonade stands and people wanting to argue the evolution side, the anti-evolution or creationist side. And it is going to begin, the trial is going to begin in July of 1925. And interestingly enough, they do choose 12 men for the trial. Most of them are middle-aged. Many of them are farmers. They're churchgoers and that kind of thing. And they go to open the trial. And that's, Chris, I think sort of sets it off with a prayer. And Clarence Darrow, the first thing he does is object to opening the trial with a prayer.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, you also have to recognize that going into the trial, I mean, all of these signs, let's be real. It was a circus atmosphere. I mean, they had pet monkeys that were out there. They were selling cotton candy, but they also had signs that basically were saying God is love. You need to read your Bible every day. You need God in your business. Where are you going to spend eternity? So at the end of the day, when you're talking about having a fair trial, the trial of the century is not getting off to being a fair trial. And it's also, remember, yes, there's 600 people that are trying to get into the courtroom. I mean, the judge even wants it outside so that everybody could witness this. But you also, for the very first time, have WGN of Chicago, which is broadcasting this trial on the radio to radios all across the United States. So it has gone from just a simple, let's try to talk about this in Dayton, to now it is a national level. You think about it today, this is kind of somebody tweeting out everything that is going on, or Facebook Live, the trial, or I mean, where they are now getting moment by moment understandings of what's going on. And by the way, Clarence Darrow and his group are clearly outnumbered in this. This is just destined to be a trial that is one-sided, but that doesn't stop Darrow from giving it his all as he proceeds throughout the case.
Absolutely. I mean, we just talked about the jury and the jury makeup, that many of them were regular churchgoers, but also the judge himself in this particular case, Judge Ralston. Right at the beginning of the trial, he goes to church at Dayton's Methodist Church, and he's sitting on the front row. And guess who the special guest speaker is? None other than William Jennings Bryan. So absolutely, when you say the defense was outnumbered and Darrow was outnumbered, he absolutely was. Now, of course, so on the first day of the trial, the defense moves to squash the indictment on both federal grounds, state grounds. And basically what they're looking for, Chris, is they want this to go to the Supreme Court. And so they're sort of setting up their case. They know they're going to lose. Scopes is going to be found guilty. They know this. This is not an unknown. So they're trying to set up the situation for appeals down the road, hopefully going all the way up to the Supreme Court, so you can get a ruling on, is it constitutional to teach evolution? Is it constitutional to teach creationism? Can teachers be told what they can and cannot teach in the classroom?
Yeah, and that's the big issue, is that with the judge who's basically saying, my only job is to see if Scopes was in violation of the statute, and not really dealing with all of the bigger issues, which is kind of exactly what Darrow didn't want. I mean, and as you mentioned, if Darrow wins, it's all over. And so he's got to lose, because the appellate courts can only make the laws that become binding on all people. So how do you go in, Ray, and you know that everything's against you, and you go in and you're supposed to give your best, but you're also supposed to lose? How does that work?
I don't know. I mean, Darrow he had his back up against the wall in this case, because like you said, he has to lose, number one, because just the setup, but number two, because if he doesn't lose, this case doesn't go to the court. So I think in some ways, Dayton, Tennessee was probably a perfect location, because you knew the outcome. The judge is clearly a Bryan supporter, or at least leans in that direction. The jury is going to go in that direction. And actually, you mentioned that this is, more about the ability to teach evolution or teach creationism, and not so much about the science itself. At one point, the defense brings in this evolutionary expert, and the judge basically says, no, you can't bring him back, because we're not here to debate the legitimacy of creationism or the legitimacy of evolution. We're just here to debate whether this can be taught in schools, or whether the Butler Act was constitutional or not.
Yeah, and Darrow comes in. I think there's some really good arguments that are happening, because Bryan is once again literal of what the Bible says, and Darrow is completely against that. And so Darrow is basically arguing that the Bible should be preserved in the realm of theology, but that it doesn't have anything to necessarily do with science.
Yeah, and it's going to be interesting you mentioned that, because on the seventh day of the trial, Bryan takes the stand and Darrow does the questioning. And Chris, it's a disaster for Bryan. He waffles all over the place. And, from the standpoint of someone sitting in the courtroom, Bryan seriously lost. But ultimately, that's not going to be the outcome of the case.
Yeah, it doesn't matter. I mean, the only thing that's an embarrassment is really to Bryan and to the fundamentalist, if you will, because they're challenged on what they believe. And William Jennings Bryan, who is this devout follower of Christ, he says he is an expert on the Bible. And basically what happens is Darrow uses illustrations from the Bible, including Adam and Eve and all of these other things, to the point in which Darrow basically tells Bryan, quote, you insult every man of science and learning in the world because he does not believe in your full religion. And Bryan responds by saying, quote, the reason I am answering is not for the benefit of the superior court. It's to keep these gentlemen from saying I was afraid to meet them and let them question me. And I want the Christian world to know that any atheist, agnostic, unbeliever can question me anytime as to my belief in God, and I will answer him, end quote, which is fine. But if your answers don't match up, you're hurting the faith instead of helping it.
Yeah. And Bryan just completely, like you said, he just dropped the ball. He dropped the ball on questions related to Noah, questions related to Jonah, questions related to Adam and Eve. He just dropped the ball on all these questions. And I think maybe William Jennings Bryan may not have been the right person to take the stand here. He was a politician. He may have been some sort of a preacher, but he was certainly not a theologian. He was certainly not someone who needed to be in that position. And I think it showed when he was on the stand. And Darrow, you mentioned earlier, he was a top lawyer, and he just, he knew how to question Bryan. I mean, maybe William Jennings Bryan could run circles around Darrow in a Bible test, but Darrow could run circles around William Jennings Bryan in a test of argumentation and who could argue the best.
Yeah, and it gets so bad that the judge actually has to kind of tap out William Jennings Bryan and basically just adjourns court and bangs his gavel and says, hey, let's take a break, just to try to stop the man from doing more damage to what's going on.
The judge doesn't allow Bryan to take the stand again the next day.
Right.
And, that tells you all you need to know when the judge says, yeah, you don't need to do that anymore, But the trial, at the closing arguments, of course, Darrow is going to look to the jury. The defense attorney, Chris, and this is something that people are going to have to get their mind around. The defense attorney looks at the jury and says, please find my client guilty.
Yeah, and Ray, isn't there something interesting about this? Let's talk about the end just for a moment. And we're historians, we're not lawyers. We have, and nobody would want us to go and defend them in court, I'm sure. But think about how Darrow closes his case, if you will. He waived the right to make a closing speech.
Right.
And when the defense waives the right to make their closing speech in Tennessee, then that means that the prosecution can't give their final speech either. Now that is genius, because what just happened is, remember, this is not about the Butler Law to Bryan and Darrow. This is about the bigger scene. This is about the bigger stage. This is more about North-South, urban, rural, economics. This is so much bigger than that. So when Darrow basically says, I close, the entire country can only go by the terrible job Bryan did as a witness, and he doesn't have the opportunity to redeem himself the next day. He doesn't have the opportunity to get up and say, let me clarify, let me state. It's over with. The lasting images of the Scopes monkey trial of William Jennings Bryan is that, yes, he might know Genesis to Revelation, but he really didn't know how to explain Genesis to Revelation to other people.
Yeah, and he's completely defeated. And Darrow stands up and says, my client's guilty. We all know it. Find him so. But the reason, again, was why this case was brought in the first place. This case was brought in the first place so it could go to the Tennessee Supreme Court and then ultimately maybe to the United States Supreme Court. Now, of course, the jury is going to find John Scopes guilty, and he's going to be fined by the judge, which is very important. Judge Ralston is going to fine Scopes $100.
And Ray, just for the help of we've been building this up, this fabulous case, right? This amazing court case is full of theatrics and all of that. Everybody's tuned in. It only took the jury 9 minutes to deliberate.
Yeah.
And we say $100 fine. In today's money, that's probably about $1,500.
Yeah.
A lot of money for a teacher.
Yeah, a struggling part-time teacher and football coach. Yeah, it would definitely be a lot of money. But anyway, as far as the case is concerned, the traditionalists win the case. William Jennings Bryan wins the trial, but they lost the war. This is going to really hurt conservative Christianity. It's going to really hurt the traditionalist point of view for years to come. And then, of course, 5 days, Chris, after the close of the trial, on July 26, 1925, William Jennings Bryan's going to lay down to take a nap, and he doesn't wake up. And Darrow is actually informed. He's on a trip somewhere, and he's actually informed of Bryan's death. And someone says that Bryan died of a broken heart, that he had been defeated and humiliated, and he died of a broken heart. And Darrow shot back, broken heart, nothing. He died of a busted belly. So it shows you that he had a reputation, and I believe by the way, before he died, he had eaten a large meal. So I think that's what Darrow was referring to there.
Yeah. And you know, he wasn't the only one to really die from a busted belly. You can also look at the fundamentalists, this whole religious movement, which had its beginnings, if you will, with the First Great Awakening and the Second Great Awakening, and really trying to put their stamp on society as far as how society acts and what it reads and what it can say, and you know, the religious mores, if you will, and the morals and values. This court case, which they basically were adamant about really trying to put their stamp, it fails. And not only does it fail, but we're talking the fundamentalist movement loses steam, but then is ridiculed and is lambasted. And Ray, if we think about it, I don't know if they fully recovered since 1925. I think that there is still this fear of fundamentalism. There is still this mockery, if you will, that society just looks at them and says, "You're just weird. You're not what America is all about. We don't subscribe to that." And so I wonder if this big rush to try to say this is how it's going to be didn't really backfire, and that they haven't really regained what they once had.
Yeah, I think that's certainly true. I mean, one could make a very good case that following the Scopes monkey trial, following this period, the fundamentalist movement sort of went underground, and it does come back, you know, in the 1980s with maybe Jerry Falwell and Bob Jones and some of this other stuff. But I think you're right; it never fully recovered from the Scopes monkey trial. And you look even today how the teaching of creationism or intelligent design is often treated in academic circles. It's treated with scorn, you know, and ridicule. And I think some of that may go back to the same thinking anyway that was going on in 1925.
So here's where we are. Think through this, Ray. We've seen this idea of religion and science kind of being against each other, and they've been these battles. And even today, I think we're starting to see this come back up. Maybe not related to evolution, but it's starting to relate to other historical events and things that are going on, where you have such a divisive nation that is contemplating what can be taught, what should be taught, how it should be taught. And I wonder if a lot of this that's happening is because they don't understand the Scopes monkey trial and some of those early fights between religion and society, that if we're not setting ourselves back up for something even more tragic because of these debates.
Yeah, and it's the importance of understanding history. You know, history doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but it does echo. And if you look back at the Scopes monkey trial, it didn't end well for either side. Yes, the fundamentalists won the court case, but they lost the war. Yes, the progressives, so to speak, the modern side won the war, but in other ways they didn't, because the Tennessee Supreme Court came back a year later, and it did throw out the decision against Scopes, but it didn't do so based on constitutional grounds. The Tennessee Supreme Court comes back and basically reverses it because the judge issued the fine and not the jury. And then, to sort of put a period on the end of the sentence, the Tennessee Supreme Court said, and I quote, "Nothing is to be gained by prolonging the life of this bizarre case," end quote.
Yeah.
So it never went to the United States Supreme Court, and the issue was never ultimately resolved. As you just said, it's still being fought today. Maybe the issue of evolution versus creationism isn't being fought as much today as it once was, but other issues between traditionalism and modernity, between, you know, traditional views and modern views, progressive views, is still being fought out today.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I believe that the Scopes monkey trial Sure, publicly it was between science and religion, but there were broader societal problems that really undergirded the importance of the Scopes trial. And, honestly, the trial of the century, the Scopes monkey trial, was when America was forced to confront its changing identity. And I think, Ray, in 2021, America is being forced once again to confront its changing identity.
Absolutely. I hope our listeners, Chris, enjoyed this episode. I certainly enjoyed working on this episode and recording this episode. If our listeners would like to comment on this episode, would like to contact us suggesting new episodes, they can always find us on Facebook, Twitter. They can email us at historyyoushouldknow@gmail.com. That's history, the letter you should know @gmail.com. You can find our podcast on Sounder FM, on Spotify, Google Podcast, and other locations where you get your podcast from. So until next time, I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
We'll talk to you later.